The lesson for today takes the form of an observation that I have made about history over the time I have studied American history. And I should point out that this applies, I have confidence that this applies to American history. I suspect that it applies to the history of other countries as well, but I won't go there for now. And the observation is this: war is easy, peace is hard. Now, that should sound paradoxical or odd or something, because war, of course, is when people shoot at each other, people get killed, they get blown up, countrysides get devastated, economies crash, all that horrible stuff. War is something that almost nobody likes. Peace, on the other hand, peace is when we go about doing the stuff we like to do. And during peacetime, we go to school, we get jobs, we have families, we could become prosperous. Well, in the words of Thomas Jefferson, we pursue happiness. That's not what we pursue during wartime. So, to say that war is easy, peace is hard, should at least cut against that ordinary notion of the two. But I'm going to illustrate my point, I hope to your satisfaction, by looking at, well, 3 or 4 individuals in American history who have served in public office at the highest ranks of both wartime service and peacetime service. In particular, America's general/presidents. George Washington, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War, first President of the United States. Andrew Jackson, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, elected president in 1828, elected for a second term in 1832. Ulysses Grant, commander of the Union armies during the Civil War, the great hero on the Union side of the Civil War, president of the United States for 2 terms, starting after his election in 1868. Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe during World War II, essentially the American hero, the American victor of the war against Hitler, and then President of the United States during the 1950s. So these 4 men, they had the experience of serving in war and then serving in peace. And I can guarantee you, I can demonstrate to you, that all 4 of them thought that being at the apex of leadership in war was a lot easier than being at the apex of leadership in peace as president. Now, I have to be careful. I don't want to seem as though I'm giving the wrong message here. I'm not saying that war is good. I'm not saying that war is not dangerous, deadly, and all that other stuff. But in terms of accomplishing one's goals, war is easy. Easy in the sense of being straightforward. Now, that doesn't mean that it comes without effort. No, it requires great effort and it requires great sacrifice, even sacrifice of lives, many lives, to accomplish the goals. But at least you know how to get from A to B. It's straightforward, and you know the tools at hand, and you know the techniques, the tactics, and the strategy that will get you there. During peace, however, peace is more complicated. During peacetime, well, you might want to know you want to get from here to there, but how you get there and how you overcome those people who get in your way, well, that's another issue entirely. See, the thing is that in war, a country, an individual who's leading the forces of his country, can employ the tools of coercion. So if somebody doesn't agree with you during war, you marshal your forces, you go to war, and you batter them into submission. If your army is bigger, stronger, more effective than the other leader's army, you win. And in war, the way you measure success is really straightforward. You win the battle, you lose the battle. You live, you die. You accomplish your objectives, you don't. And it's as easy as that. In peacetime, and now again, I'm talking about the United States, and I'm talking about the United States under a form of popular democratic Republican government. So Government where basically you get elected as officials and laws get passed by votes in Congress. In war, you can use the tools of coercion. You can make people do what you want them to do. In peacetime politics, you're stuck with the tools of persuasion. You have to talk people into doing what you want them to do. You can't, well, you don't in politics. You don't shoot them, you don't bomb them, you don't strafe them. You don't do all that stuff you can do during wartime. So I want you to keep this in mind because I'm really going to focus on the experience of Ulysses Grant and of the United States during the Civil War and during the period after the war, Reconstruction. In fact, I'm going to include the period before the war. And so let's think about it. American history. We'll start with, 1787. We can start with 1776. Independence or the Constitution. We'll start with 1787. And we'll look at problems that vexed the United States, that caused problems. It turned out insoluble problems for the United States during that period. Then we'll shift gears and look at the period of the Civil War. And then finally, we'll look at the period after the Civil War called Reconstruction, the decade to 12 years after the war, depending on how you count the beginning and the end. So, two issues in particular absolutely stymied, vexed, sometimes paralyzed, imperiled American public life, American life generally, during the period from 1787, the writing of the Constitution, until, we'll say, 1861, the start of the Civil War. And these two issues had to do with questions that are not intrinsically related, but turned out to be quite closely connected. The first issue was that silent spot in the Constitution over which exactly had sovereignty, had dominance when push came to shove. The United States has a federal government, and it has two levels of government. There's the federal government, there's the national government, and then there are all the state governments. And at the time of the writing of the Constitution, there were 13 state governments, and there was one national government. Over time, there would still be one national government. We call it the federal government, and eventually 50 state governments. And in our federal system, this combined system, there are certain things that the states do, there are certain things that the national government does. But there are times when these two arenas intrude on each other. And the question that arose immediately after the writing and ratification of the Constitution was, when push does come to shove, who goes first? Who actually has the final say? Is it the national government? Is it Washington? Or is it the state governments? If the national government oversteps its boundaries, if Congress passes a law that violates the Constitution, who is to say that the law actually did violate the Constitution? Who will determine whether an action by Congress or an action by the executive branch, by the president, is unconstitutional? We have three branches in our government. We have the legislative branch, Congress, the executive branch, the president and his agency, the executive offices, and the judicial branch headed by the Supreme Court. Now, in the Constitution, it's set up in a way that the Congress, the legislative branch, and the president, the executive branch, they can tend to check each other. But it's a little bit unclear in the Constitution. In fact, it's quite unclear in the Constitution who checks the overall system. What if, for example, Congress passed a law that violated the Constitution? Let's say violated the First Amendment and suppressed freedom of speech or freedom of the press. Congress passes a law. Now, that seems to be in clear violation of the First Amendment. But who reigns in Congress? Who says that Congress can't do that? And what if the President of the United States signs the law? You might hope that if Congress oversteps its boundary, that the executive branch, the President, would say, no, can't do that, and veto it. But what if the President signs it too? So what if you have the legislative branch and the executive branch, Congress and the President, what if they both agree on a violation of the Constitution? Nowadays, here we are more than 200 years after the writing of the Constitution, we've pretty much agreed that the Supreme Court is the body, that is the third branch of the government, steps in and says, no, no, that's too far. So the Supreme Court exercised the power of what we call judicial review. But in the early days, in fact, before the Civil War, that wasn't a generally accepted notion. The Supreme Court asserted the idea as early as 1803, but by no means did leaders of Congress or presidents agree with this. It took really until the 20th century for everybody to fall in line and say, yeah, it's the Supreme Court that determines whether the Constitution has been violated. But we're talking about the period up to 1861. And up until 1861, it was an open question what would happen. Now, there were spokesmen, and these were all men in those days, there were spokesmen for the states who said, wait, in the system where we've got a federal government and state government, the states can step in and tell the federal government's gone too far. And that's exactly what gave rise to the doctrine of what came to be called nullification. If a state thinks that the government, that Congress and the president have gone too far and passed a law violating, let's say, the First Amendment, as indeed Congress and the president did in 1798 in a series of acts called the Alien and Sedition Acts, Congress did overstep. And a couple of states, Virginia and Kentucky, said, wait a minute, we're not going to enforce those laws. We're going to nullify those laws, prevent their enforcement in our states. And there was a strong hint that if the federal government insisted on those laws being carried out, then Kentucky and Virginia, and presumably other states would have the same right, could leave the Union. They could secede from the Union. So the ultimate sanction against federal overstepping was secession. And until 1861, there was a strong and coherent philosophy of governance that said the states had the right to secede. The states had the right to prevent the execution, the enforcement of obnoxious laws within their boundaries, that the states were the ultimate arbiter. Now, as I say, by the 20th century, opinion has changed. And one of the reasons opinion changed is because of what happened in the 1860s. So remember, I'm talking first now about the period before the Civil War. So for the 7 decades, from the ratification of the Constitution until the beginning of the Civil War, there was this open question. So is it do the feds or the states? Do they have ultimate control? And it's an open question, and there were strong, sincere, intelligent, well-read people on both sides of the issue. The second question, there was a second question. A second question that caused no end of difficulty was, what are we going to do about slavery? In particular, what are we going to do about slavery in a republic, that's with a small r, a system of government that's based on the idea, well, as Thomas Jefferson said in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and they have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, slavery basically operates on the premise that all men are not equal, and furthermore, that a big chunk of people, the slaves, don't have liberty. So how can you square this circle? How can you read, speak, defend the Declaration of Independence and the principle of self-government on which republics stand? How can you square that? How can you justify that in a system that acknowledges, that allows, that supports slavery? So what do you do about slavery in a republic? Well, there were people starting in the 1780s who said slavery's got to go away. In fact, in the 1780s and early 1790s, a lot of people who said that slavery was just going to naturally go away on its own. It was already fading away in the North, and it would fade away in the South. They turned out to be wrong. In fact, slavery did not go away in the South. It did go away through the rest of the North, but it became more entrenched in the South. And so by 1830, 1840, slavery was a Southern institution, but it was central to the Southern economy. But still, even more, it seemed that there was this fundamental contradiction between slavery, the enslavement of people, the denial of liberty, the gross denial of equality, and the Republican values on which the United States was founded. So, and again, from the 1780s until the 1860s, the political system of the United States could not figure out what to do about this. Why couldn't it? Why couldn't they figure this out? Well, because there were strong voices, there were powerful interests on both sides of the issue. If everybody had agreed that slavery was fine, then it wouldn't have become an issue, and that would have been that. And the argument would have gone away. But a lot of people, a growing number of people, said slavery is not fine. During the 18th century, most people didn't think much about slavery. They just thought it was part of life. But by the 19th century, they were really starting to think, this is not a good thing. We need to do something about it. We can't hold our heads up as Americans. A growing number, not yet a majority probably. We didn't have public opinion polls on the subject, but a substantial group were becoming more and more incensed that slavery was part of the Union. Anyway, and the same thing about the states and the federal government. So there were loud voices saying that the feds have the right to determine what's what when there's a conflict between the states and the federal government. But there were also powerful voices saying, no, it's the states. The states were the ones who ratified the Constitution state by state. There wasn't a national referendum on the Constitution. There were decisions by the separate states, and you had to get 9, and ultimately all 13 states signed on. So the Constitution, they said, was created by the states, and therefore the Constitution could be uncreated by the states. Anyway, my point here is that during peacetime, the American political system found it impossible to resolve these two fundamental questions. Because during peacetime, all you can do is talk. All you can do is argue. All you can do is persuade. And, in fact, not everybody was persuaded. Not even a working majority was persuaded, really, on either of these issues. They were almost evenly balanced. And then comes the Civil War. What caused the Civil War? The Civil War was the result of these two issues, the rights of the states versus the federal government, 1, and slavery and republic, 2, coming together. And after the election of Abraham Lincoln, an anti-slavery candidate, on an anti-slavery platform of the Republican Party, a new party in the 1850s, after he was elected president, 7 and then ultimately 11 Southern slave states decided that their institution of slavery, that the institution of slavery was in mortal danger, that their lives might be in danger if they remained in the Union. So, because of their fears for slavery, these 11 Southern states exercised what they considered to be their state's right to secede. And they formed the Confederate States of America. When Abraham Lincoln did not let the Southern states go in peace, the Civil War began. And so the Civil War starts in the spring of 1861. Now just keep track of the clock here, because we've got from 1787 to 1861 essentially no motion, no resolution of these two fundamental issues. And then in 1861, the clock starts moving faster. One of the things that happens during wartime is that things go faster. It's like in a chemistry experiment. If you remember from your chemistry class in high school, then maybe you know that when you increase the pressure and increase the temperature, the speed of a reaction goes faster. Things go faster. Well, it's like that in war. It's not as though things happen that wouldn't have happened otherwise, although sometimes that is true. But very often it's things that were going to happen anyway, but would take a long time, happen all of a sudden. And in fact, in the space of the 3.5 years of the war, from 1861, almost 4 years of the war, from 1861 to 1865, these two issues were resolved. The issue of states versus the federal government, well, it was resolved in favor of the federal government. No, there is no exit ramp from the Union. The Constitution does not allow states to secede. That's what Lincoln's version of the Civil War was all about. Lincoln went to war not to free the slave, not at first. He went to war to preserve the Union, to prevent secession from succeeding. And when the Union Army defeated the Confederate Army, when Ulysses Grant defeated Robert E. Lee, it made very clear that whatever the Constitution said or didn't say on the subject, in the real world of politics, more precisely in the real world of war, secession is not going to be allowed. Now, a few years after the war, the Supreme Court came along and said that secession was illegal, but until then, that was The Supreme Court pretty much had to come up with that conclusion after the war was already over. But it was the war that resolved that issue. And how was the issue resolved? Were Southerners, were the advocates of states' rights finally persuaded? Did they say, oh, you know what? We've been wrong all along? No. They were banged over the head, and many of their soldiers were bayoneted and blown up and shot and all this other stuff. They were beaten into submission. Sometimes, well, at least in American history, issues get resolved not by debate, but by war. And wars don't take as long as debates, because in war you can use the tools of coercion. If your army is stronger than the other army, you win the debate. So, the issue of states' rights versus the federal government. Do states have the right to secede, ultimately? The answer is no. Okay. The issue of slavery as well. Lincoln did not go to war originally to free the slaves, but in the course of the war he became convinced that the Union might not win the war without freeing the slaves, and even if it did win the war without freeing the slaves, it might have to fight the war all over again. So Lincoln exercised his power as commander-in-chief to free the slaves as a wartime measure. Now, at the same time, Lincoln knew that that power as commander-in-chief would end as soon as the war ended. So as soon as he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, the statement that said that slaves in those states in rebellion against the United States are now free, he started to work rewriting the Constitution. This is, by the way, what you do if you think that there's something going on that the current systems of power aren't dealing with, that the Constitution isn't covering it, or the Congress doesn't have the power, the president's doing too much. Rewrite the Constitution, and then all previous bets are off. And so, Lincoln set to work getting passage of the 13th Amendment, which banned slavery in the United States. And in fact, it was passed in 1865, the same year that the war ended. But notice here that there was that period from 1789, 1787 to 1861 where these two issues couldn't get resolved. Then 1861 to 1865, boom, these two issues do get resolved. And why? Well, because war makes things possible that peacetime politics leaves impossible. In war, you can beat somebody into submission, and if your army is stronger than the other army, you win the debate. Southern slaveholders didn't all of a sudden realize that slavery was this evil thing and it needed to be eliminated. No. Their slaves were taken from them by the Union Army and by the Union victory in the war. So that was that. And then when the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln had control of the federal government and was managed to push through the 13th Amendment, then it was written into law, and therefore there was no more arguing that slavery was going to be legal. That was it. It was done. But the point here is that what the American system could not accomplish during peacetime, in 70 years or more, it could accomplish in 3 or 4 years during wartime. But that's not the end of the story. And in fact, to look at the end of the story, I want to look at the experience of Ulysses Grant, as one of these individuals I said who was a leader in war and in peace. Ulysses Grant became the great hero of the Union side during the Civil War. And it was because of his heroic leadership, his gifted leadership during the war, that Ulysses Grant was elected president in 1868. He was re-elected in 1872, so he served 8 years during the period called Reconstruction. And this was a period after the war when what the war had broken, Congress, the states, the American people had to put back together again. And Grant was the one in charge. And one of the first things that he discovered is that war is easy, peace is hard. He had not been in politics before the war, so he had nothing to do with the stuff before the war about states' rights and slavery and so on. But after the war, he is in charge and he has to deal with this stuff. And he discovers very quickly, yeah, during war you can use the tools of coercion. You can use the army. During peace, no, you got to go back to persuasion. And you have to talk people into stuff. Even if you're president of the United States. Hey, when Grant was a general, if soldiers didn't do what they were supposed to do, he could have the military police lock them up. If they deserted, he could shoot them. If Lee didn't do what Grant wanted to do, launch an army, launch a battle against him. So this is what you do as a general. But as president, he couldn't fire members of Congress that he didn't like. He couldn't fire Supreme Court justices he didn't like. When you're president, well, actually, when you're in politics generally, you have to persuade people. And he discovered that, in the immediate aftermath of the war, the South was somewhat intimidated. There were still Union Army forces in the South, and if Southerners, in particular, the Southern elites, the slaveholders and their families and people around them, they realized, okay, we lost, we can't secede, and we no longer can have our slaves. All right, that's not coming back. But we don't have to be happy about it. We don't have to be happy about the idea that the federal government is really more powerful and lording it over the states. And we certainly don't have to be happy about the fact that these enslaved laborers, their families, who were our property before, are now free and are asking for wages instead of accepting being told what to do. We don't have to be happy about this. And in fact, we're going to do whatever we can to sabotage the emergence of something that looks like a system of equality in the South. Because Southerners, they weren't convinced that slavery had been wrong, most of them. Okay, we just can't do it anymore. We don't have the power to do it. But the same notions of white supremacy that had undergirded slavery still existed in most whites. They didn't go away. And so whites now who didn't own slaves, they still looked upon the former slaves. They were called freedmen, and freedmen included freedmen and women, former slaves. They still looked down on the freedmen, and they considered them second class. Well, what? Were they citizens? Yeah. When the 14th Amendment was passed, they became citizens. And even the 15th Amendment was supposed to guarantee them the right to vote. But it didn't make the white elites, the ruling class, and they were white supremacists. They wouldn't have denied that. They said, we don't have to allow these people to be equal, and we'll do everything we can to prevent that. And here's where, this is where, Grant was kind of stuck. So, to combat the emergence of black voters, black men and women vote, excuse me, not women, black men voting, the groups like the Ku Klux Klan were put together to intimidate, to terrorize, in some cases to murder blacks, former slaves, who had the gall to go vote and vote against their former masters. And so the Ku Klux Klan, I'll focus on that. There were similar groups elsewhere. But the Ku Klux Klan used, the tools of sort of war. These were paramilitary groups to keep blacks from voting. And Grant in fact did use the Union Army against the Klan in the early 1870s. He sent the army into South Carolina and busted up the Klan. But he couldn't change the minds of those Southerners. And when the American people as a whole decided, we're tired of looking after the South. We're tired of trying to make the South do right. And Americans as a whole, Americans in the North, Americans in the West, they decided, we're just going to forget it. We want to go back to our own stuff. We want to go back to the affairs of peace. When people outside the South said to the South, look, it's up to you to do what you want to do, then much of the culture, much of the social life of the pre-war system of slavery was reintroduced, not under slavery, but under the Jim Crow system of segregation. And although Southern states never tried to secede from the Union again, they still interpreted federal laws the way they wanted to. So it was hard to deal with slavery and states' rights before the war. They were dealt with very quickly and successfully during the war. After the war, slavery is gone, but segregation sort of takes some of its place, and the states begin to reassert their own view of things against the federal government. So the war was relatively easy, straightforward for Grant. Reconstruction, by the end of Grant's second term in office, he was tearing his hair. about this. What are we going to do? He realized he didn't have the support of the nation to deal with it, and essentially the efforts of people like Grant to preserve the rights of African Americans, to preserve the gains of the war, they just fell by the wayside through the fatigue of Northerners. It was easier to do during the war than it became to do during the peacetime, and that's the moral of the story.